And hello, everybody. We are going to have a lesson, a presentation on the Protestant Reformation, which is a vital area of study, both in world history and in European history. Um, so we'll be looking at the developments and the schisms that result within Christianity in the 16th century and the early 17th century, resulting in the 30 Years' War, which has the effect basically of creating the construct that, pluralism in is fine. We can get along with each other geopolitically, despite having differing theologies and religious beliefs. Before we start, I just want to make a comment. I am in no way endorsing or putting down any of these belief systems. We're looking at this from a historical perspective. And, it's basically belief systems. William James, an American philosopher, said all religious beliefs take a great leap of faith. You have to go into the unknown. So it's kind of foolish and unkind to go after someone's religious beliefs because, again, they're all anyone who does believe in a religious system, they've taken a leap of faith, and that's just what it is. So let's look at the historical context of the Protestant Reformation. By 1500, the Roman Church has become deeply ingrained in all of Europe, other than in Russia. And Russia is a little bit, it's Europe, but it's not really Europe. It's kind of a separate entity because of a lot of reasons. You have strong monarchs, and they want to start gaining in power. So you have the church that's been very strong, and you start having these strong monarchs like the Bourbon family in France. You have the Tudors in England, and they also want to have power, and they don't necessarily want to share it. They don't. That's the context going on. That then you start having a theological issue come up in Germany, and it splits the church. It splits, and you have a reform movement who become Protestants, and the Roman Catholic Church. And later on, it's the protest movement or the Reformation is going to split twice more. So it's quite a time of development. And the political fallout of this belief, the change in beliefs, is huge in Europe. So let's go into what it starts off. It starts basically as a reform movement. Luther does not want to break away from the church. He's a monk. And what happens is he has these theses. He develops arguments. He has 95 of them. 95 theses are arguments against practices and beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church. And he nails them to a monastery door in Germany. Now, the Roman Catholic Church has some obvious problems going on with it. Like any organization, it was subject to corruption. Any organization is subject to it. Some of the bigger problems was one called an indulgement. And this was something where basically if you had done something wrong or it was a sin, you could pay a certain amount of money to a church and you would receive an indulgence or forgiveness for that sin. Another problem was simony, and this was selling of church offices for money. And this is now tied into the concept of primogeniture that we've talked about often, and the idea that a ruler would have an heir, then a spare, and if he had a third son, that one would go to God. And the idea was to curry favor within the church structure, that you could have this person who has noble birth and is connected politically to a powerful family or a king or a ruler of some type, and then he will be given a high office in the church and have influence and sway in the religious world. And a lot of these people ended up serving as counselors to other nobles and stuff. So it was a real strong mixing of church and state that was going on. And finally, you had nepotism, which was the appointment of family and friends in offices. That's not the only concerns that Luther has. Luther has concerns about clerical immorality. There are large numbers of popes and other people who were not following the vows that are required of someone who is in a leadership position in the Roman Catholic religion. And the three aspects are that you have to take a vow of humility, poverty, and chastity. And there were popes who had children living within the departments of the Vatican at this time. Many cardinals had children. They also were very heavily involved in wealth exchange and other deals that were very political and got their hands very dirty, and their hands were supposed to be clean. So there were practices of breaking church rules, drunkenness, and not living by celibacy. Priests were ignorant. A lot of these people were uneducated, especially these people who were coming from noble families. They couldn't read. They didn't know the catechism of the Roman Church, and yet they were put in very high positions many times as a bishop, as an archdeacon, and in charge of religious issues and the secular issues if you're a deacon of the church. You had simony, the selling of church offices, like we said, pluralism. You could hold multiple offices in the church, especially if you were someone of power. And we talked about nepotism. So these things really were upsetting to Luther, and he promoted ideas that ran against him. He was upset about these practices, but he also had theological differences with the Roman Catholic Church. Luther believed that salvation or acceptance to God comes by grace through faith only and not through works and rituals. The Roman Church said, yeah, salvation comes by grace, and that's a gift, it's through, and you get it through faith, but you must do works in order to complete your salvation. The hierarchy, he said, of the church is not founded on Christian principles, but really more on political structures. He believed that there is a priesthood of all believers, that you don't necessarily need priests and church officials to contact God. It's done directly, just like salvation is through grace. It's the same way. So he wanted to talk about these things and was hoping to have a large conference about it. It never got there because the printing press spread his ideas like wildfire. And before you knew it, you had this massive change. And there are a lot of people who believe and like what Luther does. And his ideas, especially the construct of the priesthood of all believers, is almost like you have proto-industrialism, like industrialization, industrial practices that are happening, like cottage industries that will happen before the Industrial Revolution. This is very much proto enlightenment ideas, where John Locke and other people are going to come up about the nature of man. And it comes from basically the gains that have been made in human understanding and the beliefs about man himself through the Renaissance. So in 1518, the Roman Church holds a diet, not a diet. It's a diet, and it's held at Worms. And they basically say, Luther, you got to go back on these ideas. They're not going to fly. And Luther just says no. And in a quote, he says, "Here I stand, God help me." Luther is excommunicated by the Herp, and he's declared an outlaw by Charles V. That means he's outside the king's peace. He's outside the law. Well, Luther is an important figure, and he has a lot of friends, especially among the German princes. Germany is not a unified state. You have a whole bunch of series of princes, and they're in a group called the Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire would go on to say was neither holy, nor was it Roman, nor was it an empire. And we'll be talking about that throughout the year because it's a major important state. Luther finds friends with the prince, and other princes start harboring Protestant ideas. They like them for religious reasons. They also like the idea that now it's weakening the power of the Roman Church. It's going to weaken the Holy Roman Empire. It's going to weaken their standing, and these princes see a chance to rise. I'm not saying that that's the primary motivation, but it's definitely there. And for some, it probably was the primary motivation. Now, once you start protesting, people started protesting against the protesters. And Zwingli is an example. He does not agree with the Roman Church, but he doesn't also agree with Martin Luther on mostly theological ideas, the role of sacraments, baptism, confirmation, things along those lines. Then you have Anglicanism, which is purely political at start because it keeps almost all the tenets of the Roman Church. And basically, King Henry VIII wants to get a divorce from his wife. The Pope will not give an annulment of that marriage. He says, no, you're married. And there's a political reason for that, because his wife is the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. So there's a connection there. He doesn't want, if he gives a divorce, he upsets Spain. If he doesn't give the divorce, he upsets England. And they've developed Anglicanism, which kind of grows up in its own little area because England is part of Europe, but not quite part of Europe since they're separated by water. Later on, John Calvin comes up with, and he writes a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. It's a massive tome. It's an amazing read. And he bases his ideas of Calvinism, and it's basically his major idea is on the idea of the predestination of the elect, that God chose certain people to be his elect and his church. There's other people, though, who resist Calvinism, and they're called Anabaptists, and they have a couple of unique views. During this time period, they don't believe in the baptism of infants, but you need to be baptized as an adult. That's an adult decision. This puts them into conflict with the Lutherans and the Calvinists and the Roman Church. They also have a very interesting stand that's unique to them. They do not believe that Christians should serve in the government nor in the military, especially in the military, because it involves the state's right to kill people. And they believe that goes against the law of God. And this leaves them way out there on their own. And they're pacifists, so they're going to really have a tough road. And groups that are considered Anabaptist would be the Mennonites, Quakers, and things like those. And many of them seek refuge in the United States during, at times in Europe's development. We're not going to go into the Peasants' War much, other than basically people look at Luther's idea of the priesthood of all believers, and they see that this is a really raising up the estate of mankind. And peasants who had been treated quite badly for many years, they start saying, well, hey, if we can go to God directly, why do the nobility have all these special rights over it? They're just basically a different form of the hierarchy of the Roman Church, and they revolt. Now, Luther condemns it. First he's silent, and then he condemns it, and the peasants are crushed. The powers that be, they don't want to hear any nonsense about this idea that, that's basically of common people having rights, and it's crushed quite severely. So we're not going to go into much more than that, but let's kind of go back to these belief system. So what you have Christianity, basically the Catholic Church, and then you go through the Great Schism, which divides the Catholic Church into Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox, and it's basically over who is the successor to St. Peter. Protestant, as their religious beliefs, are very similar. They're not quite the same, but they're similar enough in many things. Lutheranism breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church. And this is basically a summary chart of Lutheranism versus Catholicism. They both believe that Christ is the Savior. They both believe that the Bible is the holy book. So these are continuities. Some of the changes that Protestantism go, the Roman Catholic Church confirms the authority of the Pope. Lutheranism denies it. Church hierarchy is confirmed by the Roman Catholic Church, the priesthood of all believers with the clergy, but they're equal. You don't need them for sacramental purposes. You don't need a priest, and it's the priesthood of all believers. So that's a big difference. Confessions of sins, you go through the church in the act of confession, which is one of the sacraments in the Roman Church. Here, you go through prayer to God directly. Means of salvation, faith, but good works follow it. Participation in church functions and living out your life. And it's not necessarily that you don't do wrong things, it's that you do right things that had been recognized historically and through the church's dogma. Here it's faith alone. The Roman churches tend to have more of an ornate style as a place of worship, and the Lutherans tend to be much simpler. Then Calvinism comes along, and these are the 5 basic beliefs of Calvinism. A big aspect of Calvinism, though, is they believe that the kingdom of God should be on earth, and that the elect, when they have it, should be having a lot of say in political and in basically secular processes, particularly civil law and other types of law. And makes sense because Calvin is a lawyer. So this is a big split. This splits basically the Protestants into those who stay Lutheran and those who become Calvinists, and they take over large portions of Switzerland. Lutheranism had mostly been confined to Germany, and in here you have Switzerland, but now you have big swaths of Europe becoming Protestant, whereas England also had become Protestant under different circumstances, basically wholly politically. You have Italy, France, and the Iberian Peninsula are staying Roman Catholic. The areas here are also the southern part. This is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These are staying primarily Catholic, although they're having problems on their border with Islam. Okay, so let's now look again here at the contrast. Basically, you have the Savior being the same. You have the Holy Book being the same. The authority Pope is again denied. Basically, you have the construct again, priesthood of all believers, that they believe with Luther, they stay with Luther. But here again, you have the church hierarchy, confession of sins. Again, it's very similar to Lutheranism, and it's very similar to Lutheranism. But the big difference is going to be in election, and also in having secular law taken over by believers who are basically put into government. So a continuity with a change from Lutheran is the idea of predestination. The city of Geneva recognized the Bible as supreme law, and that means secular law also. So that's different. And Geneva is really where Calvinism takes its big roots. And the church has the right to punish people who violate church or secular law, which is different. Okay. So the community here is that basically it's the faithful. Here, the community is a consistory, and they have the right of punishment. So now we have Anabaptism, which is basically a response to all the Protestantism, and this is the last one on board. But it's not that far. This is happening all between 1517 and the mid part of the 16th century. So they believe in adult baptism rather than baptism of children or infants. They believe that the New Testament is the Bible for all source of living, and particularly the Gospels and the epistles, but also Sermon on the Mount is huge in Anabaptist beliefs, the way that a Christian should live their life. They shun the outside world, outside the community, because they believe the rest of the outside world is on a path that's too secular, and that they believe in separatism. That, and again, this shows in their response to the state, is that the state should be obeyed, but that believers should not join the state function, because the state has powers that make it inherently ungodly. Especially, they believe they have the right to end life, and they're firmly against this. They meet in homes instead of churches oftentimes. They refuse to hold government offices. They refuse to use weapons and fight in wars. This is big, and they're going to become targeted by Roman Catholics and by Protestants. The result of this is eventually this becomes the turmoil is so great, and it's not just religious turmoil, it's the political upheaval that it's dividing Europe all over into camps. France goes through a major issue with Calvinism, and results in the death of two kings by assassination. This is becoming a big problem, and in 1618, they do actually, let me backtrack, in the 1550s, they make what's called the Peace of Augsburg. And it's the idea that every ruler of a province in Germany can choose his religion. But the only two religions that are on board are Lutheranism and Catholicism, and Calvinism is not allowed. Well, there's a Calvinist prince who says, hey, that's not right. And this becomes the start of the 30 Years' War. Now, you can argue, is that political or religious? And, that's something that you'd probably want to look at some documents, and we can investigate later on. So you have here the 30 Years' War, which starts in 1618. After 30 years of fighting, it is the 30 Years' War, a peace is solved. It's a series of peace treaties, and it's called the Peace of Westphalia. And this is important because what it does is it basically says states have the right to adopt a religion, and some states are also developing a lot of religious toleration within a larger state, France in particular. Even England, which has a state church, there is so much resistance to it as they expand and they change from England to Great Britain. They have to include others in the conversation. And this becomes a large part of all the rights and constitutions later on in Europe, is this idea of religious toleration and freedom to exercise freedom of religion. So the concept is that Europe becomes pluralistic religiously. It takes a war to do it, and it's a pretty tough time, but you really haven't had any religious strife resulting in a war, because Europeans, and I would say by extension, the Western world, and that would mean the United States certainly, and Canada, we do see a demarcation, a separation between church and state, and that they, although there's not a wall separation as some people talk about, and the construct of separation of church and state is not found anywhere in the United States Constitution, it's that the church and state are sharing a road, and they bump against each other and they influence each other. But as far as authority, legal authority, the state has its own authority of law, and the church has more of an authority of moral suasion that it has within individuals to modify behavior, et cetera. And so that's basically we've had not really had in the Western tradition, in Western Europe, or in most of Europe, and in the Americas, in North America in particular, we've not had a lot of religious conflict. And even South America has kind of given a lot of religious autonomy to the states, and as it has changed its demographics in the last 50 years and becoming much more Protestant, there's not been like really serious outbreaks of violence over religion. So I hope that clears things up for my world history students and gives you some information that you need, and also gives my European students some understanding and a good review. Have a great day.